What's going on, 3DMJers? We are back with another episode of the 3DMJ podcast. I am fortunate to be joined by Coach Jeff Alberts and the great Amanda Rizzo, our mental health specialist on the team. And today we're going to be talking about how to understand the value and the quality of the information you're consuming online, even when you're operating in the so-called evidence-based space, because sometimes not all the science-based content is as accurate as we'd like it to be. Often this is not intentionally wrong. People certainly mean well, but as we've discussed many times on this podcast, often science-based information is sometimes presented as a commandment or a highly specific outcome. And beyond that, it's not the only valuable content that's out there. What about all of your experiences? What about the folks who are not your uber nerds like myself who are trying to produce useful content? What can you take away from that? I think sometimes it's viewed as not useful or even sometimes actively harmful to talk about what you're doing if you don't have, hashtag science in every single post. And I think that's a really unfortunate and damaging way of doing things, because there is so much value in experience, and truly science cannot answer some of these day-to-day questions. And I'm also really excited to talk about how, with mental health becoming more and more and more popular online and people talking about it and promoting it, of course, that's a good thing, don't get me wrong, but it also comes with many kind of quote unquote pop culture mental health things that maybe are not necessarily always ideal or could even have unintended consequences. So I'm really excited to have y'all on. So thanks for joining me. So Jeff, I wanted to speak to you first about this, because I know you often get these comments, because I think you do a great job of sharing your own journey. Hell, that's the way 3D Muscle Journey started. It was your personal blog way back when. And I thought, honestly, I think you've always done a very good job with this. You've never spoken too confidently. You've always expressed this was your journey. You've shown people, hey, here is what I have found to work for me that is successful. And it's not like you've ever been a quote unquote not evidence-based person. You've always been aware of the concepts and principles and the ones that you feel confident in you've expressed. And, you help people understand that what you do is an example of one of the options catered to you as an individual, to your context, as you likes to say. So anyway, have you found that people are starting to get that, or is there still a lot of confusion as to when they see you do what you do, that it is the way to do it, or how have things been on the interwebs lately for you, Mr. Alberts?
I think I've seen some improvement. I think people are more accepting to some of the things that I do. Of course, the big one is the low volume thing. And I always kind of, wonder like how are they comparing that volume. But what I've been really engaging with people lately is, even though I'm kind of coming across, like you say, like, hey, this is how I do things. It's not necessarily, it's generalized for everybody, but I'm kind of hoping that by explaining the whys behind the things I'm doing, the principles, that people might be able to, take a tool here and there, maybe apply it to their own process and, see for themselves if it actually works or not. But even now with explaining that in depth in my posts and all that, I still have those people that will kind of, start out in an engagement with me by saying, like, I feel this is the best, or this is the best exercise, and they don't really have anything to kind of back it up or any explanation other than it's just the best with it, just in general. So it's almost like, okay, how am I going to engage with these people? You try to come across as like, okay, it depends on context, and always kind of, if I do engage in depth with somebody, I want to know their context. I'll ask, follow-up questions. Why do you feel like it's the best? What are you basing that on? So in a sense, just asking questions to try to gather some information where I can actually engage in a healthy manner to maybe, enlighten them a little bit as to maybe some other tools they can use that could be the best for a different situation maybe. And also too, like I've come across some conversations where I've actually learned a thing or two from someone else by having an open dialogue like that. But what I've learned over the years is whenever I've tried to engage with people, like if they say it's the best, and I'm like, no, bro, it's not the best, and I like challenge them in that way, it usually doesn't end up too well.
Yeah.
So, so I try my best, like just to come across as someone who's, you know, have humility, when making posts and things like that, and try to engage with people in that manner to see if I can educate people and maybe they can educate me in return.
I think that's the way to do it. And I think there's no avoiding human egos generally, but especially not in bodybuilding. And I think a lot of people, the need to defend what they're doing is a strong need because it's probably speaks to something greater, like their worldview or their intelligence or their worthiness and being identified as a bodybuilder, et cetera, et cetera. And I think to some degree, like obviously we don't want to just be like, oh, this guy's jacked, so therefore he's right. But I do think it helps that you are a pretty muscular dude. You're pretty successful. You've had a low rate of injuries. You're still going, and you're competing at the highest level in natural bodybuilding still, even though you're at a point where many people would have, aged out due to injury or just not being able to hang. And because you have that and you're humble, I think it's a really, really good example because it gives an example of someone who got to where they are not by being dogmatic and not by pushing things on people. And I think your open-mindedness comes across. Like you often have in your posts, like you have, here are the things that I consider on how I got here. So I think even someone who might find themselves benefiting from a higher volume approach with different exercises, I think they can benefit from your process of explaining how you got to where you are. And I think that's something that is a really good example. So for all the people out there who are not trying to put out the hashtag science content, or they're not trying to make sure they're posting study results, do know that your individual journeys and also the journeys of your athletes, if you are a coach or if you're a trainer, and how you've helped people figure out what works best for them, is an incredibly important piece to the puzzle. Because the science-based content is something that by nature speaks in generalities. Like the entire statistical paradigm we have in quantitative science, null hypothesis testing, it's all based around comparing group averages and making conclusions that generalize to most people on average. But it's very difficult for people to look at that and go, okay, well, I've got this study and it says for these 30 resistance trained men and women that they did better with this program than this. So therefore, everyone should be doing that. It's hard to explain to them, well, no, there was people in both programs who would have done better on the opposite, but just the majority of them seem to do better here. So by the very nature of science, it tells us here's the ballpark. But guess what? Some people are going to operate outside of that ballpark. So people like you, Jeff, or others who are finding success with the general principles, but maybe are outside of the typical X's and O's of, say, volume distribution or frequency or what have you, are great examples, in my opinion, not of people, quote unquote, doing it wrong, but finding a way to take those principles and apply it to their situation. And I think to some degree, the fact that people contact you and don't quite get it, some of it's human nature because we like simple answers. And there's so many people out there telling them there is a way or the way to do things. But I also think we have to take some collective ownership that science isn't often communicated in that way, or not as much as I'd like. I think there's plenty of science communicators who do it right, but many people give very specific advice with a high degree of confidence that is still science-based. So they're on kind of quote unquote team good guys and gals, when it comes to how we view them in terms of social proof and whether we, allow them in the circle. And I'm not saying we should gatekeep them out, but one of the general principles that I try to use and that I'd highly recommend for anyone producing content is that the specificity and the confidence of the recommendations you make should match the specificity and the confidence of the evidence. So for example, if we've got a meta-analysis, so that's a pretty high quality of evidence, right, that says, hey, periodization is better for strength. it's okay to report that, but you wouldn't say, hey, my specific undulating program with these exercises, reps, and sets that last 12 weeks and trains on 4 days is the way you must train. Oh, by the way, here's a meta-analysis, right? Now we've got a mismatch between specificity. So most of the time, because we're speaking about group averages and science is these broad brushstrokes and getting you hopefully in the ballpark, that means you're going to have to make a concession on either specificity or confidence. And that is really where the in the trenches experience comes into play. The specificity can come in the form of the examples of what we've done with our clients, what we've done with yourself at different stages in your career. And therefore, the more experience you accrue as a coach or an athlete, the more useful you can be to people. And I think as a consumer of information, what you want to do when you're looking at science-based content is to specifically assess, is the claim being made highly confident or highly specific? And honestly, most of the time that should be at least an initial, flag that comes up. It's not that you can never make specific or confident claims with science, but it's a pretty high bar to clear for doing so. It requires a pretty specific study design. And so when you're looking at these claims, if someone is talking about big picture principles like volume, progressive overload, fat loss, and they're telling you something super specific, like you must do this number of sets for this muscle group, or you must, have this size of a deficit, or X, Y, and T will happen, or you must have your macros set up at this degree. That should be, to some degree, a little bit of a red flag because the individual differences are going to supersede those group generalities. So anyway, when you're consuming content, basically assess, is the content producer following that same rubric? Are they giving me the appropriate level of confidence and specificity that the evidence provides? And when they do give specific information, are they backing off on confidence, saying, hey, here's the best way I think you should do it based on my experience? But of course, your mileage may vary because all we know from the research is generally you probably want a periodized strength program. That's totally fine. Or the alternative, I'm very confident you should have a periodized program. Here's 20,000 different options you can do, But once someone kind of breaks that rubric, it's not that they're doing anything wrong or that it's intentional. I think we often do crave specific answers, especially science-minded people. Like we wish everything was math. We wish we were all nice carbon copies of the same thing and that we can just use studies as evidence in every single situation. But the reality is we're all highly different people in highly different contexts and highly different cultures. So I think we have to be able to understand that most of the time we're giving a concession on one of the two, and that's where the experience steps in. So anyway, Jeff, that's kind of how I wanted to position what you do as extremely valuable, because I don't think most of the stuff I can talk about tells people what to do on Thursday when they step in the gym. But I think if they are aware of how this can be implemented by looking at the various athletes and coaches, I think they will actually move past that speculative stage and move towards action.
I think as a coach, I come across it a lot with my athletes is that even though we have, X, Y, and Z set up based on their context, it's hard not to kind of look to your left and right on the internet and see the content that's coming out. And not that all content is wrong or misleading or anything like that, but it's not like catered to their specific requirements. And oftentimes I'll get challenged, hey, I saw this, and this. Why aren't we doing that? And, that's the thing is like when I'm myself, like personally, like when I'm consuming content and there's some evidence-based content that I see, it's almost like it's so nuanced and so specific to just one little thing. Like it's almost like minutia. Like for me with my experience level, it's like you hit the nail on the head, Eric, with the experience level, I can just quickly whoop, this doesn't really apply to it's just so nuanced and it's like not even 1% of the equation. Like this isn't even going to make too much sense for me. And this is an advanced bodybuilder myself. So I just I go right past it. So I like, for me, I'm thinking like, okay, if I'm someone who's new to the game or even an intermediate and I'm soaking this up, like it's so believable that this is so important. Like I must know all this nuance in order for me to make that progress. I think that's where a lot of people as consumers, they get really sidetracked. That's where, you get that paralysis by analysis coming into play. So oftentimes, like when I'm working with an athlete, and more times than not, they're not advanced like myself. It's almost like I have to kind of undo a lot of that. Like when I get them or when they're questioning it, I have to try to educate them on what to look for. We're looking for the principles. If we apply the principles in this way, in this manner, these little nuanced things probably aren't going to make that much of a big difference. So that's the big challenge for me as a coach. And you can probably I'm sure Amanda can speak to this stuff too.
Yeah, I'd like to share some parallels that I experience with clients coming to me for therapy. Very similar situations where they'll say, okay, I need to do CBT. I got to do cognitive behavioral therapy. I know it's the best one, it's the golden standard. Can you do that? Or any other therapeutic model. And so I'll ask them, okay, how did you come to that conclusion? Why do you feel like this is the best therapeutic model for you? And then I'll present to them my therapeutic stance and how I approach therapy and see if we can align and have a better understanding and how we can merge the two. Because oftentimes it's just based on what they read on social media or something that they found on Psychology Today, like this is the best. And sometimes they also come with very specific desires, like, okay, do I need to do self-affirmations 5 times a day and look at myself in the mirror to improve my self-esteem? Well, maybe you do. Maybe that would be helpful for you. Or maybe you just need to, I don't know, maybe set some boundaries with some family members. We need to gather more detail about the client and the context of their lives rather than just focusing on some form of approach that could be deemed the best. We have to really tailor it to what works best for them, what their lifestyle is, what their background is, their way of thinking, their worldview, and go from there rather than just cherry picking and saying, okay, this is the best. Let's just apply it all across the board.
It's funny. I'm glad you brought up CBT and then tailoring things to the individual, because for those who don't know, this is an important step. So this is not me throwing any shade at CBT, but to get to the point where you could get insurance reimbursement for mental health therapy, one of the key steps that had to occur was to demonstrate the efficacy of therapy.
Right.
And because CBT has a very specific manual, it could be repeated. You'd have certain levels of clinicians. There are actually multiple RCTs as well as meta-analyses on CBT compared to typical, like non-other treatments. So they're not typically compared to other treatment models when you look at the research. And they do have, small effect sizes that improve, for the most part, they're small, that improve certain mental health outcomes. So you have to have like a DSM that says, here's a given problem. Okay, we've identified depression. We've created this box to put people in. And then we've created this box for which practitioners to operate in. We've created these studies, and we have an outcome. But I think, and Amanda, please feel free to disagree with me if you think I'm wrong, but I don't think you will. Depression is not like having a virus. There are many paths to Rome, and there are both genetic and also environmental things that can impact whether you have depression. And that is something that is true of nearly all mental health issues. There's a huge genetic component to anorexia, but you may never develop it if you're in a different environment than someone else who might have been exposed to certain stresses, traumas, messaging, etc. So there is, therefore, a different etiology to get to the same thing that is diagnosed in almost the same way as something clinical. Like, if you go to an MD, we do a blood test. Do you have the HIV virus or not? Okay, you have HIV. That's pretty clear cut, and that's why the treatment can be very generalized for most people. And we have a drug that we might give you for certain conditions. But how you treat someone when they have a certain mental disorder could be very different and dependent upon their context and should be tailored to them. So just because a certain clinical method, cognitive behavioral therapy, lends itself towards quantitative assessment and having this proof, which is an important burden of proof, and now that's why Amanda, you can have people actually pay you through their insurance company today in the modern times. Not a bad thing. Don't get me wrong. And it does actually bring, mental health therapy under the umbrella of evidence-based practice. It really doesn't say the same thing as saying, hey, we need to assess what your individual needs are for therapy and modify the treatment plan based upon what your needs are. Much in the same way, and probably to an even greater extent than what Jeff is talking about in setting up, a training protocol for a bodybuilder. So, am I talking BS or I got your backing here?
Discard it all.
Total nonsense.
No, absolutely. I wouldn't approach someone coming to me for just general anxiety and say their learning style is just auditory. Talk therapy is going to be very beneficial. And let's take CBT. CBT has a few behavioral components, a few action items as part of their interventions. So maybe I won't use those interventions with them compared to someone that is very kinesthetic and likes to experience things to help them learn. So sometimes I would say most of the time I integrate various modalities with just an individual client.
Mm-hmm. Totally makes sense. Yep. And yeah, that's really what it comes down to is the more things that can differ between individuals when trying to get to the same outcome, the more you'll need to have an individual approach that is tailored. So, like I said, treating a specific virus is going to have very few treatment options. That's a limited flow chart, right? Building muscle, much less limited flow chart. Some of the same big pictures. Dealing with childhood trauma, which like saying that doesn't even mean the same thing for two people who might even have a similar home environment. I mean, like, how often do you hear about so there's multiple siblings of a similar age who grew up in an abusive home with parents who are addicts. One might become extremely extroverted, combative, and tends to really struggle with authority, and it maybe even have some struggles with violence and anger management. Another might completely shut down and try to make themselves invisible to survive, and another might be the peacemaker between everybody. So you get 3 people of a similar age raised in the same environment with a lot of shared genetics, they're siblings, but have wildly different personalities, wildly different adaptive behavioral mechanisms to deal with that challenging situation. And those are going to have certain consequences. One person might need to be in anger management. One person might need to stop being so codependent, the person who's trying to fix everybody. And one person might need to actually get in touch with their feelings that they normally block off. All for the same quote unquote environmental problem, if you will.
Right.
So, and I may have just described, members of my family, but no disclosure there.
Typical family dynamics.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So that is, I think that's a great example just to show that the more there are multiple ways to get to a single outcome, the more just this explodes, and you have to rely on a practitioner's skill sets rather than just rules, right? And that's why I get sometimes nervous, Amanda, or we were talking about off camera, on how it's great that mental health is becoming less stigmatized. It's becoming popularized and people are talking about it. And there are more and more professions entering the fray, like health coaches are now a thing, and there is a ton of people who have, good knowledge, good practice, stay within their scope and do a good job with people. And then there's a lot of people who don't,
Right.
and it's no different than nutrition, right? So it's great that there's more attention here, but there's also a lot more opportunities for someone who is consuming information to get information that's not as helpful as it could be or could be actively harmful. So let me ask you about that. Now, when you're on social media, and I'm sure your feed looks a little different than mine because of the fact that you are a mental health specialist, how often do you run across stuff and you're like, I don't know about that? And what are some of the typical issues you see with some of these very generalized, quote unquote, mental health awareness-based posts or recommendations that you see on social media?
I think the main problem is a word you just used. It's just very generalized. It's kind of like blanketed advice, kind of good vibes only, everything's good, positive mindset. That can be helpful for most people if you're stable and you're doing pretty all right. But for a lot of people that are really challenged with mental health issues, that's not going to help. They really need to explore in depth their inner world. And so just giving like kind of a prescription of something that's along the lines of cancel culture, like, well, I'm not going to hang out with you negative people, doesn't really get to the root of what's going on for someone that's struggling with depression or social anxiety. So we run into a lot of challenges with people not really addressing what's going on inside of them.
Yeah, I think what narcissists need more of is posts that tell them that everyone else is the problem and you just need to surround yourself with people to support you. That's definitely what they need. What's going on, 3DMJers? Eric Helms here. Thanks for listening to our podcast. I just want to take a second to tell you about MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. This is a monthly research review that I put out with Greg Nuckols, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Dr. Eric Trexler. We cover the most up-to-date, peer-reviewed research in the world of strength and physique sport that's directly relevant to your practice as a coach or athlete. We provide our reviews in written format, but also, since you enjoy our podcast, audio roundtable reviews where we discuss the research in depth. Finally, we also do video concept reviews where we cover a broader topic in video format for your learning. For fitness professionals, you can take quizzes on MASS content and earn continuing education credits in most of the biggest certifying bodies in the fitness industry. If you want to sign up and get a subscription, head over to 3dmusclejourney.com and click on the Products tab. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening. Jeff, let me ask you this, and this is almost kind of skirting with another potential podcast that maybe we should have somewhere down the line, but how often do you have the athlete who maybe it's their first time getting into bodybuilding, or maybe they haven't been exposed to some of our content or some more experienced athletes' contents, and they expect other people to adapt to their decision to compete? Like they would be mad at their partner for getting pizza, or they expect the people or friends around them to change their lives because of their decision to compete, and there's a certain, I think to some degree we've all done this a little bit in our history, in our past. It's very important to us. This is someone we care about. I have my needs. It's not immediately doesn't sound like you're being an ass. When I present it this way, like I'm making it sound like what a D-bag, but I think it's actually quite normal for your first time. Like, oh, I'm embarking on this new journey. I'm very excited. It's going to be hard. Hey, like, can you help me out, partner, or parents, or what have you, sibling, depending on your living circumstances. But and then sometimes we get from clients, they get pushback from their family. And I think I used to be of the mindset when I was a younger competitor and coach of like, well, you need to explain to your family why this is important. They don't have to like bodybuilding, but you want them to support you. And I sometimes wonder if the person I'm saying that to, did they hear it the right way? And now I often start with, well, Take a look at how your behavior has been impacting those around you. Do you think that other people have had to change their lives because of your decision to go through this process? And that's kind of what I lead with, instead of, yeah, those family parents just don't understand. Like I shouldn't pull out the Will Smith line, and go that way. So that's I think an example of how you might hear what you want to hear, engaging with some of this mental health stuff in the bodybuilding world, where we ask people where people go through very odd things that can have an impact on the people around them. So anyway, Jeff, I just wanted to open that up to you.
I thought you were talking about me in my 20s.
Well, I was talking about me in my 20s too.
Yeah, I mean, my bodybuilding is everything, right? Everybody's got to cater to. I'm doing this special thing, so why isn't anybody understanding this? They should be catering to me. How dare they ask me to go out to eat with family and socialize with them and have a pizza? Or eat in front of me. Like, how dare they do that? Like, that was kind of the mentality. Yeah, it's like, I'm special. I'm doing this special thing. It's super important, and people should just expect to, cater. They should be catering to me. And I kind of lived that way for a long time. And it's not my proudest bodybuilding moments is, looking back in hindsight through my 20s. and even partly into my 30s of just, just putting it such on a high pedestal and not really thinking about other people and how my bodybuilding was actually impacting them. Because if anything, what I realized, with, learning, going through it myself and learning how to balance things out a little bit better and working with hundreds of bodybuilders, that, man, this impacts people around you probably more so than yourself. Like, it's easier for me to kind of change my eating habits, but now, like, think of how, like, okay, you're not eating X, Y, and Z with the family, and now they're in their mind, like, okay, how do I go about this? Like, do I cook different food? Do we eat separately? Like, causes a lot of stress for people outside of us. So, like you said, Eric, it's like whenever I have those athletes now that kind of say my family doesn't get it, they're not supporting me. I try to make it a point, like, try to explain to them that what you do is probably impacting them more so. And, because you're changing, like a contest prep, for example, that can be anywhere between, on average 4 months up to a year process, where now all of a sudden you're changing your behaviors, and some of those behaviors are pretty extreme. So it puts a lot of stress, puts a lot of burden on significant others, siblings, grandparents. I don't know how many times, and the culture thing too, because I had some families, they put a heavy emphasis on food, and all of a sudden you're not eating grandma's cooking, grandma's getting offended, doesn't understand why. Like, what do you mean you gotta get down to 6% body fat? I don't get that. What are you talking about? That's not healthy, So grandma kind of knows, like, this is kind of weird and extreme. So why do I have to change because of this? So there's just a lot of that kind of goes on. And I think what we don't see on social media is this type of conversation. And at times I actually post about this because I don't think it gets talked about enough. And, even like I've seen as a coach, you kind of see sometimes people's personal lives, and sometimes, like, prep's over with, they have to fix a lot of things. There's relationship issues, there's responsibility issues, priorities where, jobs have been impacted and things of that nature. So I think it's super important, as a coach, that I try to educate my athletes about these types of things before they even dive into it. And really try to get them to communicate, not just like, hey, coach, this is my macros I hit and this is my body weight, but how are you doing? How are you doing with family and all that? I know sometimes it can be, there's times where I don't want to, let's say, cross a line. Like, I don't want to impede on their personal lives. So there's always kind of like that fine line to walk on. But if I get any type of inclination that there's some stressors there, then I'm probably going to inquire a little bit, just for their own well-being. And if it's beyond my scope, that's why we have Amanda. So that's why I refer out. But
I've had clients come to me saying that they go into prep to try to fix all of those things that you said, like family relationships, job stuff, even finances.
Yeah,
I don't know
how. I can speak to my own experience, is that oftentimes I prepped because I felt like I didn't have control outside the gym. Right. So I'm like, hey, I got this bodybuilding thing that I can fully control. So, again, once prep's over with, you're like, okay, that problem is still there, So, yeah, I think it's super important that, I try my best to try to educate. Not just with the athletes I'm working with, but every now and then toss up a post here and there that kind of speaks to that. Because, you see online, and you guys have probably seen this, it's like, you see shredded bodybuilders, it looks so great. It looks like they have their shit together. Here's this guy or gal that's like, man, just an awesome physique. And the way they're posting and coming across is everything is perfect. But again, I know there's probably more to that story than just that. And sometimes I think with some people, it's just, there's problems there that they're just not really speaking to.
Yeah, I think it's really important to note that we don't want to judge a book by its cover and base the value of a message on someone's physique per se, or how they're necessarily presenting on social media. We really want to dive deep and see, like, okay, where are they getting their information from? Not just, okay, this guy looks good, Let's go with it.
Yeah, and it's simplicity sells, nuance doesn't. And in the mental health space, you typically, I notice when it intersects with fitness, you typically get like one of two dichotomous extremes. You get like sunset yoga pose, looking out, and good vibes only.
Yes. Yes.
You got to match your vibrations to the world. Speak your truth.
Yes.
And then on the other side, you get black and white photo, grinding, pushing hard, and like obsessed is the word the lazy use to describe the dedicated. The Gogginses out there, like the basically suck it up, push hard.
You got to sacrifice.
Sacrifice to win, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And it's funny, like one is basically saying this is, you have to take some personal responsibility, you need to have discipline, and the other is saying whatever you're feeling right now is right. And both of them can be very useful messages in the right context for certain people at certain times, but man, never the twain shall meet, right? Like these people, they don't hang out. You know what I'm saying? Like they are in ostensibly the same fitness and wellness circle, but they have blocked one another long time ago for either being toxic or being soft or whatever the way they describe each other are. When ironically there are times when you need to acknowledge that this is something that you do need to display a little more discipline for lack of a better word, or that you need to just rely on yourself, and there are times when you need to just be more accepting and open. And there's, like I said before, telling the narcissist that everyone around you is just spreading bad vibes when they probably need to be more aware of how they're impacting on people around them. It's pretty important. And also for the person who used to have an eating disorder and is extremely self-critical, and they've moved on to fitness, pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and controlling more and just putting down any negative emotions and pushing through it. They've been doing that their whole damn life, and that's just really going to burn them out and push them into the dirt. Just that very judgmental person sitting on their shoulder is going to become the only shoulder they have. So it is concerning to me when I look at kind of the mental attitudes, mind, like psychology game, if you will, in the iron game is you really only get like these two extremes, and you very rarely get nuance. And unfortunately, I think there's probably, at the moment, far more non-professionals who are making this type of content about mindset, quote unquote, rather than actually seeing sports psychologists, marriage and family therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, licensed clinical counselors, people who are actually professionals in this space.
So it's like the people that are doing this, are they doing it to genuinely help people, or like what's their motive? Like, are they genuinely trying to help people, or are they generally just like, hey, I'm just trying to like make it all feely good so I get more followers, more revenue? Like I always kind of like, for me as a consumer, I always kind of like read a little deeper into these posts, like what's the motive behind this? And I need to like actually dig deeper into this person's posts, or maybe they write blogs, or they have a website or something I could check out, or videos. Like really just try to, like, I really want to follow this person. I like to know like what the motive is behind that.
What are their intentions? And I think the next question would be, how do you determine whether or not someone's ideology or approach is right for you, or it's beneficial for you? How are you able to determine that? Do you solely just focus on the evidence and what they're presenting in that sense, or is it all just energy and feel and vibrations? Where's the line, and how do you determine that for yourself?
Well, for me, I can speak to me. It's like, it's kind of like when I listen to music, like what am I feeling right now? Like what am I, and does it make sense? Is it garbage music? Like, oh, this is just way over the top. Like I'll never like dig this ever. And I kind of just go away from it, or hey, I'm in this easy listening mood right now. But I mean, maybe Eric could speak to this better, but like for me, like when I'm looking at evidence-based stuff, like I said earlier, if it's just over the top nuance, like it's easy for me to identify it, but someone who's newer, and I think that's where the challenge is with social media, is people like, because that's the question I get a lot, like, what is good information? What isn't good information? And there's just so much of it now. Like I can see how some people are just like, it's just mind blowing. Like, who do I follow? Like, where do I go for this information? So I just don't have enough knowledge base to kind of answer that. So this is a question for you, probably Eric.
Yeah, it's a meta question, right? It's how do I look across the broad space of all the different types and people providing information and figure out how to create something cohesive from it? And how do I do that when I'm new to this space? And that is hard. And the first thing you do is make sure you listen to this podcast before you've ever looked online. Solved. No, but in seriousness, like I think the way to do this, Jeff, is you have to understand the limitations of each one of these sectors that we're talking about. And then you have to understand what your tendencies are and also what the intentions of the people producing the content. So there's actually a nice little intersection between the three of us here. So when I created the muscle and strength pyramids, I very intentionally, like the most front-facing thing is priorities. It's a hierarchy. Because, and I blame this on marketing, but I don't think it's only marketing's fault, and I'll talk about kind of how this intersects with you, Amanda, in a second. But marketing does generally use clickbait, high priority things, like you were saying, Jeff. Like all of these things are being talked about, some incredibly nuanced things, and they all seem to come across as being just incredibly important. Getting the right number of sets, putting the right weight on the bar, making sure you choose the exercise that perfectly biases this head in this range of motion, etc. So from all of the various levels of the pyramid, everything could, in the right light, look like the most important thing you need to do right now. So I very intentionally created a hierarchy as the front-facing thing to help people just kind of filter the information. And then inside of each one of those things, I'm always speaking in continuums and ranges so that people can understand that, okay, there's broad ranges here. There's not very specific outcomes. But as I was saying, I don't think it is just the marketing. Amanda, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but I think because of the obsessive nature of a lot of people who are seeking answers, they try to solve the math problem beyond the solution. Like they want to get it, like maybe the best we can do is some relatively complex algebraic formula, but they want a singular number. They want 6. What is the meaning of life? 42. Like that's what they want, right?
That's a good number.
It's a good number.
Yeah.
It's unfortunately not the meaning of life, but that's a different number if those who want to Google it. I can't remember what it is. It's from...
flip it. It's 24. You flip it around maybe? No?
It's true. That's just from a different perspective. There's actually a... God, is
They're
it...
all right.
Oh, there's
They're all
meaning of
valid.
life. Is it from the Life of Brian? I can't remember. There's a funny movie where the meaning of life has a specific answer. I think it's Monty Python. It doesn't matter. Some better dork than I will be able to know, but you can Google it. What's the meaning of life? And you'll get a number. But I think the problem is that I can tell someone, hey, here's the priority list and here's the ranges, but they want something more specific than that. So it's not just the marketing. Like they will look at Jeff saying nuance, context, gray, all of the standard Jeffisms, which are so great. And then they'll look at you do this exercise and they'll be like, hey, I think there's a better exercise, or this is the best exercise. Despite like, you'd have to, like the entire philosophy of the person you're interacting with says like, that's not the way you should think, but it still happens. And I think it's because there's a lot of people who are engaging with bodybuilding information and who are bodybuilders who want more specific information. They want very, very highly detailed, and like they want every bit of the equation solved, even when there aren't certain parts that are ever going to be anything more than a letter. They're not going to be a number, So Amanda, I'm curious as to what you think about that when people, like, how do you deal with your own obsessive tendencies when you're seeking out information, where you'll just, like, you'll keep seeking, like maybe the best you can get is, hey, when you write a program, you probably want to be somewhere when you start between, 6 to 12 sets per muscle group when you first write a program as a novice. If that's the most detailed that you can get without having a training experience, like if that's a decent starting zone, and I think sure, why not, right? I feel pretty confident in saying that. If I know nothing else about you, you have no training experience, that's where you should start. The problem is that person can find someone who sounds legitimate and maybe even is legitimate who might make the error of giving them an even more specific value. Like, no, you need 14 sets for chest. And when they look at that, they go, that's the specific answer I wanted. 6 to 12 is not. And I am drawn to that because of my obsessive tendencies. How does someone have the self-awareness to hopefully circumvent that happening so they don't just keep going down a rabbit hole that isn't going to lead them anywhere better and might actually be maybe less specific to their individual needs?
I think a few things are happening in that process where someone might be results oriented and they're just focusing on getting the best and most optimal result rather than why they're doing it in the first place. So you want to examine your intentions behind why you want to achieve a certain goal, and what you believe you'll get out of it. And then I think we might be touching also on projection and fear of the unknown. Like, I need to have all of the answers figured out right now, or I can't make the first step. But oftentimes we won't know unless we step into the arena and start to see how you respond and react to, just 12 sets of something in a given training period. So what I would approach that is kind of just quell the fear and explore what's going on for the client, and see if we can mitigate that, what their expectations are, and try to bring them back down to earth.
That latter one is the biggest one I come across with people in this realm, is the fear of the unknown, because they want to know the specific answer before they actually even do anything. So as a coach, I'm asking you, Amanda, like, how do you kind of I always, try to say, okay, we have to, basically get out of a comfort zone here and let's be reactionary. Like, okay, let's put something in place. Like Eric said, okay, we're going to do 6 to 10 sets, 6 to 12, and then go about it. And then let's be reactionary based on how things are going. We'll adjust one way or another. We're going to get closer to your truths because we're actually going through the experience of it. So do you have any tips or whatever for, coaches who can maybe approach that conversation with someone who does have that fear of like not having the specific answer up front?
Oh boy. Sometimes I am able to meet a client in the middle. So I would ask them what helps them feel safe. So what are some protocols that we can do to mitigate that fear, and also explore what they're telling themselves about that unknown, because the unknown is the unknown. There's nothing there. The fear comes with what you're telling yourself about the unknown. So if we can explore that a bit more, and maybe we can break it down, and maybe it's unfounded, I think that could be helpful for some people.
That sounds like asking them to ask themselves. So let's assume the worst case scenario. Let's get a little like, okay, let's say the right amount of sets for you is 6 and we chose 12. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? They might reflect and go, I guess I won't die. I guess I will probably just feel a little under recovered and make my progress a little slower than ideal. And you go, okay, and then what will happen? Well, let me think about it. I guess I'll report that to you, coach. We'll lower volume and I'll start getting better results.
Yeah.
And because I don't think that question gets asked most of the time. I was reflecting as you were talking, Amanda, and the first thing I was thinking, for someone who's just a pure consumer, Jeff asked about the coaches, which I think we should get back to, and I'm sure you have some things to say on that, Jeff, after Amanda providing that advice. But I think for the consumer, the first step is to recognize when you're seeking out of fear, right? So you find 6 to 12. You keep looking. Maybe like let's say you found the muscle and strength pyramids, but you wanted to keep looking for additional information. Why? you know? Maybe you're just super analytical and you wanted more specific advice, and you don't buy that I provided the most specific that the evidence provides. Fair enough. You don't have to agree with my paradigm of thinking. That's okay. More power to you. Maybe you'll find someone who is able to provide a little more specificity. But you're eventually going to run into the limits of the knowledge of science, and I'm pretty confident that it's not going to be specific as you want it, or everyone would be doing the same program, right? So you're going to get to a point where you've reached the end of the equation, at least for now, without you doing some individual investigation and the actual journey. So then what propels you forward? If it's fear, it's pretty easy to tell when you're afraid, I think. That emotion, you feel the butterflies in your stomach, you're clenched up in your stomach, maybe you feel that tightness here. You're searching rather frantically. People distract you while you're on your phone or your computer. You get annoyed with them. Like, I got to solve this now. This is a problem. That's, I think, when you identify that, that's when you might go through that process of, what am I afraid of? What does it mean to me to not get this right? Am I afraid of the unknown? And what's the worst case scenario that could happen? And then be able to sit in that space where you're contrasting what you think is probably logical, as if the worst case scenario of you not getting the perfect program, versus what are you afraid of? And that is probably the best thing you can do on your own, I would think, But I am actually curious about your thoughts on that, Amanda, and what it means for coaches and how they can help facilitate that.
Another thing that came up to me as you were saying that was, oftentimes people think it's wasted time if we're not getting to the specific and like the most perfect program, if you will. But I like to reframe that and say it really isn't, because it gets us closer, and it's a process of elimination. So it does help us get closer to, okay, what's optimal for you as an individual. So that's another thing that clients come to me with. But it's just like all a waste of time. I shouldn't have done that.
That's good. Yeah, because that's something you run into in science. People have probably heard about, like publication bias, that results that are significant are more likely to get published. So sometimes when you assess the overall field, you kind of get this weighted, skewed thing where we think more studies got left in the file drawer. Not that we do that on your computer. It's 2022. I'm sorry. So papers get left unpublished because they found null findings, right? So then we're skewing towards the positive. Maybe we're not representing the true effect size. Maybe we're making it seem like some supplement that doesn't really work actually does, because there's some false positives and we result in this publication bias. One thing that I make sure to do when I talk to students, because man, when you're doing your PhD, when you're doing your master's, it feels like the most important thing, the hardest thing you've done in your life, and you want all this work you put in to matter. And I try to help them understand, hey, if you put out the study that helps us realize we don't need to worry about X, Y, and Z, fantastic, because now we can spend that energy somewhere else. And I think the same thing is true of exactly like you were saying, Amanda. If you go down a rabbit hole with a potential protocol that won't be perfectly optimal for you, and it's not, fantastic data point. Now we can move on. But if instead you try to set something up that is very, very specific and hopefully should be optimal for you based upon XYZ person on the internet says, you might be further away from what might be ideal from you, and you're actually making that investigative process take longer. So I think that's 100% accurate.
You're actually conforming to something that may not even be the best thing for you. So even though X person is saying this is the most optimal way to do things, it could be totally suboptimal based on your own context. And I see this all the time. And I think for me, what was good about growing up before the internet was that I had no one to really follow. So it was almost like I had to kind of learn as I go. And I got really okay with making mistakes. And to me, it's helped me, in a sense, get that much closer to self-mastery, because if you trial something and let's say it doesn't go too well, it's as easy to go, okay, if you're aware it didn't go well, you're like, okay, let me cross that off the list. Now I move on to something else. So it's a process of elimination, and you start to learn more about yourself. So that's why I'm really, like, whenever I post, I'm really confident in what I'm posting, because I'm posting about my process and the years that I've gone through that process. And it's the reason why I am where I am now, is why I am advanced, because in a sense, I've been my own science experiment. and I've been okay with like messing up. But I think now it's like going back to the internet, like the social media thing, it's like there's just so much content to follow. And I can see someone like I get this a lot, or I see this a lot with people, like they mesh their personality with the content provider's personality. So if it's like, okay, this person's talking about this and they relate to it, then they're going to follow it. And if it's not something that maybe they should be doing or something they need work on to avoid doing, then they're just kind of stuck in that bubble. They're not really getting challenged. They're not getting taken out of their comfort zone to actually learn something new. And this is kind of like back in when we first started coaching, Eric, when everybody wanted you to be the coach because you're the science guy. And when you speak, it's like, you know what you're talking about. And it's like, for me personally, like I don't have that knowledge base that you have around the science. So I was a little bit insecure back then because I'm like, man, these people just, they don't think I know enough. And you would kind of just in so many words say, it's not rocket science. It's a lot of it's common sense and practicality.
It's literally not rocket science.
Yeah. And you would basically just say, like, Jeff, I'm not going to do anything different than what you would be doing with this particular athlete. So I think that's kind of a lot of the problem too, is like how you're kind of consuming content. Sometimes it's like it's okay to maybe go with something that isn't something you might, let's say, agree with or you're unsure of. That's how you kind of learn more.
Ironically, I remember back in the day, I was very comfortable writing, our basic program guidance. But then when someone wouldn't respond well, which is a normal experience as a coach, I would freak out, and I would hit up you, hit up Brad, hit up Berto, and be like, what would you do in this scenario? So they are different skill sets, to have confidence on what probably works okay for most people most of the time versus what do I do when those stipulations don't produce progress for somebody. When I didn't have the years of experience behind me with athletes or with myself, my wrench isn't working. What do I need here? And you're like, it's a nail, dude. Grab a hammer. I'm like, a what now?
Mm-hmm.
So that was something I couldn't fast track. It wouldn't matter how much research I read, and I think that's honestly, that's why Andrea said, we need to start a podcast. We need to have a way to display the importance of these coaching skills, of how does experience come into play? Because there is so many people, we're talking circa 2011 or 12, who can talk about muscle protein synthesis, who can talk about mTOR, who can talk about daily undulating periodization patterns. And man, do they sound like they know how to solve everyone's problems and they got the optimal thing. But many times they didn't, unless they also concurrently had coaching experience. So I'm actually really proud of our podcast and that we've been able to speak to the importance of having thousands of hours under your belt, of starting in the realm of these principle-based programs and then figuring out, well, what do we do when it doesn't work like we thought? And what are all the various things from sleep to mindset to nutrition to environment to genetics that could be, playing a role as to why we need to try something else. So yeah, I was intimidated too, just at different time points and for different reasons, my friend. So yeah.
It's interesting too. I don't know if this is going to relate to what we're talking about or not, but like back in that time, this is like 2010, 11, 12, in that era. I was like, I would, put my stuff out there, and it's really not, I mean, obviously I got a lot more wisdom now, but even back then I was still kind of speaking to what I do and the reasons behind it. And it was almost like I would get a lot more pushback back then, because back then it was like, if, like you said, there like all these people that are kind of just reciting the science, it was almost like, okay, that is on a pedestal, and like anecdote and personal experience, like it was almost like a versus thing, like experience versus science. So for me at that time, I struggled to kind of jive, but now it's almost like I kind of see the opposite. It's almost like it's flipped to where now it's like people are kind of like, oh, you just got to have fun, you just have to have fun. And they like, you don't need the science. So I'm kind of seeing like that reverse. I don't know if you've noticed that. Maybe it's just my feed, but that's what I'm kind of noticing now. Is like, it's almost like 10, 15, 12 years later, it's flipping around, as opposed to like, you could actually blend these things. It's kind of a little of both at times.
Jeff, I tell you what, I feel like the gray Jedi always trying to keep us from the extremes of either these, because I mean, even before 2011, 2012, it was, what do these lab coat, pencil necks know? I am a Mr. Olympia. How dare you? That was the attitude. I can't eat strawberries. No, it's only blueberry. Like, no, what are you talking about? Chicken during that phase, you gotta eat orange roughy. And I don't care that I'm getting anal leakage during that in my prep. That's the reason that thins my skin, you know? And you act like that I pulled that out of my ass, no pun intended, but that's some legit stuff that I've heard. Or cheese during contest prep, don't you know that thickens the skin? And you're an idiot. You're so much smaller than me. And then it became, what do these bros know? Like, if you're an IFBB pro, I think you're more likely just to be wrong, in 2011, 2012, And I do think we're bouncing between these extremes. I think we're in a better place now overall. But man, have I been trying to ring the bell of, these are different things. They serve different purposes. They should go hand in hand. You're not an evidence-based practitioner if you're ignoring research or experience. They must both be there because they're not the same. And using one in place of the other will give you repeatable, predictable errors in your process. So now I agree with you, Jeff.
I think something that would bring more of that balance, per se, or just that grayness in the industry is more collaboration between the producers. And that's something that within the field of therapy and licensed practitioners, it's very much encouraged. Because you can just get stuck in a certain way, and maybe you're not giving the best to your clients with that. And with collaboration and consultation, you get to see, I have different options. I can implement different interventions or different protocols with my clients. So I think that's something that we as a industry could really benefit from, instead of just saying, oh, I have the right answer, this is the best way, this is the best approach. And you guys can't top that because I have the results. I have all of these clients turning pro or whatever. Maybe we need to be a little more open to different approaches.
Absolutely. I think as healthcare and even training athletes, sports science moves towards a multidisciplinary approach, and people getting good at what they do and acknowledging the fact that they are stronger, having a community-oriented approach of multiple people doing different things. I'd like to think we embody that here at 3DMJ. I think the more people can do that, great. And then from the consumer side, it becomes increasingly important to go back to what we talked about earlier, is to know the limitations and the role of each one of these things you come across. Know the influence of how important both evidence in the more scientific format as well as the experiences are, and how one takes the baton from the other. And then also be aware of how marketing can make you lose that perspective of how, someone can make it seem like, despite the fact that this is only covering the upper top part of the pyramid, this is only a supplement, they make it seem like the most important thing that supersedes all else. Or someone who is relying on anecdotes, which really can only tell you that the collection of things this person didn't prevent them from having success, but doesn't tell you that it is the only thing to do. Is more than the experience can tell you. Instead of it just being an example of how to apply this in a given context that seems to work, you taking it as the gospel. And then finally, I think to what Amanda has been discussing, at least in part of many of the awesome things she said on this podcast, also be aware of how your own emotions, your fears, your desire for perfection, your desire for driven by obsession, which probably driven by fear in many cases, is leading you to seek out answers that are beyond the scope of what we can actually tell you at this stage in your career, and what would really take you doing self-experimentation over time. Like Jeff, you brought up the time in the magazine era, there was one piece of information every month from 3 different magazines that you could get confused by, and that was about it. And let's be honest, most of them were just recycling the same articles. Like, how many times do we read about Arnold's arm routine in both Muscular Development, Flex, and whatever other magazines that we were following back then? So now, unfortunately and fortunately, you can go to Google and you can find an answer to every question you have. And you can find 100 of them, and many of them conflict. So how do you stop yourself from seeking answers where there are none to be found yet for you? And I think that comes down to assessing your own emotional response and the emotions driving you. Then you can kind of short circuit that and go, ooh, this is coming from a place of fear or obsession. Maybe I should have stopped this an hour ago. And maybe I just need to experiment. So it's great that we have all these answers, but if at a certain point you can't differentiate between which one is the most valid, you need to go back a few steps. And you need to understand the boundaries and the limitations of what each one of these things can tell you. So I think we've done a good job with this. Not that I'm trying to end the podcast prematurely. Is there anything that either one of you want to add to this, to where we've gotten thus far?
I think you've done great. I think we've probably brought a lot of awareness. I think we've done a pretty good job of offering some solutions, so I'm happy with this.
Yeah, I feel complete here.
Hey, if Riz feels complete, we are complete. She is the mental health, heart, and soul of 3DMJ.
We can end session.
That's right. And plus, we don't have the money for any more billable hours from Riz. Mental health is
going
expensive.
Over the time, man.
That's right.
My fee went up, so I don't think so.
Yeah, your insurance is not going to cover this, folks. So unfortunately, we're going to have to end it here. But thank you so much for taking a trip down this discussion. And hopefully, either you or your clients will be able to better differentiate between the information that they need and that maybe is pushing them towards obsession, and maybe that they don't need, or might even be taking them off track from their own investigative journeys. We'll see you next time. Thank you.